This is an older story, something that happened to me almost 20 years ago when I was 23 years old. I was writing for a popular budget travel guidebook series and mainly worked in Central and Eastern Europe. Depending on the time of year and which issues were being updated at the moment, I could be gone for several weeks or even several months at a time. Mainly, I traveled alone. I'd run into a few problems here and there, but my experience was predominantly positive. I'd been working in the former Yugoslavia and was on my way to the Czech Republic. It was a long journey by train, so I broke it up into several overnight stops. Zagreb first, then Budapest, making each leg around 8 hours. It was late January and very bitter. There was probably a good 7 inches of snow on the ground, perhaps more in some places. I was exhausted and battling the remnants of a flu I'd picked up in Split. I left in the late afternoon and expected to reach Budapest around 10 p.m. I bought my ticket in the travel center, and when I boarded the car, about half the compartments were empty. There were definitely some other people on it though. Since the train wasn't too crowded, I managed to find a compartment all to myself. I spread out a bit because of this and prepared for a long ride. The first part of the ride was very smooth. I worked on some guidebook stuff, wrote some notes in my journal. A few hours into the ride though, we passed over the Hungarian border and things started to go awry. I heard them before I saw them. They were a group of teen boys, about 5 of them that I could see, and they were quite loud. I could hear them running through the train car, laughing, cursing, and banging on the compartment walls. They were loud and obnoxious, but it's not the first time I'd ever been annoyed by a group of teenagers. I didn't even look up. I kept on working on my writing. As time went on, though, they grew louder and louder. As they ran from car to car, they slid the train doors open with so much force it sounded like a bomb going off every few minutes. Then they got even louder. That's when I noticed they were standing right outside my compartment, looking in at me. I could only see 3 of them through the small window, but there were definitely more behind them. I'd seen them earlier. I glanced up at them, frowned, and then looked away. I'd learned the best way to deal with this kind of thing was to just ignore them. I didn't want to encourage this behavior, but ignoring these guys seemed to be having the opposite effect. "Lady, lady," they hollered at me. "Come have some fun." The compartment door was closed. They proceeded to mess with me by slowly opening it, pretending they were going to come in, and then slamming it shut again. They went from chanting "girl, girl" to a much more ominous "we're gonna fuck tonight, and you'll fuck us all," followed by a bunch of slang. At this point, I started to grow nervous. How was I to know whether they were just messing around with me or being completely serious? I mean, I couldn't exactly leave. I'd have to walk through them to do that. They were blocking my only exit and entrance. Then, one pulled out a pocket knife. He stuck out his tongue, ran the blade across it, then pointed it at me and grinned. I tried not to show anything, but my mind was quickly taking stock of what items I absolutely had to take with me if I made a break for it. My lack of reaction seemed to anger the one with the knife, so he switched from licking it to using it to penetrate a circle he'd made with his thumb and forefinger. "You're gonna die," he called out. Part of me figured they couldn't really do anything. There were other people in the train after all, and surely they'd hear me scream. Someone would come and help me, right? The conductor hadn't come through since we did the border crossing, so he was due for a trip around this time as well. I figured I only had to get through the next few minutes, and then they'd get bored and leave. It was at this point I noticed the curtain on the door window. I know it sounds crazy, but that's when I lost it. I'd left the curtain open so people walking by could see the compartment was occupied, but now all I could think was that if they came in, all they'd have to do was pull the curtain closed, and nobody walking past would see what they were doing to me. At least one of them had a knife. They were taller and bigger than me, and they outnumbered me. I started to tear up. What was going to happen to me? I was 23 years old, but a late bloomer. I had a history of sexual assault, too. My day pack was in my lap, and the only things I had in there that could be weapons were a fingernail file and a butter knife. I reached into my bag and fumbled around until I had one in each hand. The first guy slid the door open and stepped inside, knife pointed at me. Another voice filled the corridor. I didn't need to speak the language to hear the anger. The kids ran from my compartment, the one dropping his knife. I watched as a middle-aged man dressed in blue stomped after them. A few seconds later, the train came to a grinding stop. The world outside was so creepy. All I could see was snow and blackness. There were no lights in sight. After a few moments, the train started back up again. The boys did not return, though. I was just starting to feel some relief when the man returned to my compartment. It seemed he was the conductor. "You speak English?" he asked. I nodded. "I made them leave. They're gone now." I thanked him and he came into my compartment and sat down across from me. It felt good having another person in there with me, especially an official. I felt safe now. "It's okay. They're gone." "Thank you," I replied. I was so scared. He nodded knowingly and leaned back into his seat. "It happens sometimes. We get people like this. They can't hurt you though." I honestly felt like I was going to pass out from emotional exhaustion. Just as I was starting to let my guard down though, the conductor leaned forward again and said, "You need the fee." Oh, I produced my ticket and showed him. "Well, here's my ticket." He looked at it, shrugged, and handed it back to me. "This is a ticket, yes, but there's a fee for Hungary. You didn't pay." This was the second time I'd made that route, and I'd never had to produce anything extra on the train itself. Now I started feeling sick to my stomach. He quoted me a number around 50 USD. I knew he was taking advantage of me. I wanted to argue, but then he said, "If you don't pay, then you have to leave now and get off with those guys." We were literally rolling through the blackest night I'd ever seen. The snow looked like it would come to my knees. I didn't want to be dumped in the Hungarian countryside with those boys who were harassing me. I felt like I didn't have a choice. He waited while I rooted around in my backpack and produced $30 in a combination of Czech, Bosnian, Croatian, and Slovenian bills. I left myself 20 USD. With that, he took the wad of cash and stuffed it into his pocket, and then he bolted out of there. Once he was gone, I gathered my things and headed to the bathroom. I had to pass by the other compartments as I walked down the corridor. It was that moment I realized I'd been wrong the whole time. There were no other riders in the other compartments. They'd all left at some point. I was the only person in my car. If the guys had come in and attacked me, nobody would have been there to help. I'd have been all on my own. I cried for 5 solid minutes in that tiny bathroom, and then threw up in the middle sink. So I walk to most places I visit because, being severely visually impaired, obviously I cannot drive. I walk at night during summer, which lasts anywhere from April to October if we're lucky. This is probably not the safest idea, but I'm from Texas, so temperatures of 100 degrees plus aren't that unusual. One of my more usual destinations was a convenience store a few blocks from my previous home. I set out one night, just like normal, to grab myself some Pepsi and a candy stash. Our town was not very big, and most other people drove everywhere. It was very unusual to come across anyone else on my route to the store because of this. On this night, though, a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere and started to talk to me like he knew me. He asked me where I was going, and I told him I was just going to the store. It wasn't unusual for people to keep watch on me, because hard of hearing blind girls with forearm crutches might need a bit of help, I guess. This guy had no reason to be out there though, and was walking way too close beside me. He asked me where I was going, and I told him just in case I was overreacting. I sped up as much as I could, since this part of the route was very dark, with only a subway that had already closed for the night. He was definitely not there for a $5 footlong. I tried to appear calm. I was shaking to the point though that I was afraid I'd drop my crutch, which was the worst thing I could do right then. Especially after he started talking about how easily he could have his way with me in a ditch and no one would ever know. I felt sick, but I continued on walking. What else could I do? The store was only about 20 yards away. Luckily, I happened to know the guy who worked there on the graveyard shift. I got safely inside. My friend handed me a bag to carry my stuff until I was ready to check out. When I got up to the register, he began to speak loudly enough that my ears hurt. I had to turn my hearing aid down because it hurt so much. "Hey babe, you ever find my 3DS? I played along, and he opened the half-door thing and I sat on a stool like it was normal. The creepy dude came over and slammed his Bud Light and a 10 on the counter. After being handed his change, he went outside. We waited for a bit before my friend spoke to me. He's still out there waiting by the ice machine. After about 20 minutes, he still had not left yet. My friend called his manager, and after explaining the situation, she told him to lock up and take me home. He did, and even walked me in through my door. We stepped inside together. Catherine told me to give you this. He handed a keychain to me and showed me how to lock and unlock the pepper spray. Then he said this, "Hey, call us before you come from now on. That man has been following you for the last 4 weeks or so. He comes in after you every time." He left, and I made sure the door and window was locked that night. So this event happened to me back when I was 20 and was going back from my aunt's house, where I'd give lessons to my little cousins each week. I was a student back then, and it happened in winter when it was quickly dark around 5 p.m. I must also say I'm a woman, and unfortunately that's not very helpful when it's getting dark out. I was going back to the train station to take the direction home because I lived quite a few stations away from my aunt. At that time, it was around 6 already. It was really dark and cold outside. I remember being particularly tired too, so I didn't give much attention to the direction the train I was waiting for was going to. As soon as it rolled in, I went inside. It was really crowded, so I stood up for quite some time. That didn't help much with how tired I already was. After some time, a seat finally cleared up. I snapped it up as fast as I could. I let out a heavy sigh that attracted the attention of the people beside me. I was a little ashamed by that, so I just looked down at my phone and didn't pay much attention to the others for the rest of my ride. At some point though, I noticed the guy in front of me looking really intensely right at me. Then again, I was so tired I didn't really think much about it. I just continued watching whatever was on my phone at the time. As we rolled into a station, the train stopped, and the driver informed us that was the last stop. I had my headphones on, so I didn't hear the entire message. I thought I had to stay on the same train and it would just go back on the same line after a few minutes. While everyone else went out, I just switched places to go somewhere with no one beside me. It was a seat comfortably near the window. When the train was soon to start again, the man that was looking at me earlier walked straight into my zone and sat right in front of me. I was focused on my phone though, and didn't pay much attention to him. It was quite strange though. The entire wagon was empty where I was. There were tons of empty seats where he could have sat, but he chose right next to me. The train started up again, and I was happy to finally be able to approach my home. As some stations passed by though, I noticed something odd. The stations were the ones I'd already passed by before. In fact, the train was going back to the direction of my aunt's house, not where I lived. I realized I hadn't heard the message right in the first place. I was a little bit angry because of this, but most importantly, I laughed at myself. It was the first time I was so tired I'd done such a mistake. As I was smiling at my own foolishness, I started to look around me. I saw the man sat before me. He was looking confused while switching his gaze between me and the windows. I laughed and gave him a small smile. I thought he'd also gone in the wrong direction too, since he had been in the same train for a long time now with me. But he didn't smile back. Instead, he glared at me and got very angry. I remember getting a chill at that moment. My senses finally woke up to make me realize there was something wrong with this man. I stopped the video I'd been watching and started to think. I had two options. The first one was to just stop at the next station, change sides to take the train that would actually get me home. That was the most logical and normal option. I didn't know why, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't go home alone tonight because of the man in front of me. I decided to stay on the train instead and see if he would get off before me or not. After all, I was sure this was not his direction either. I stayed. At least 4 stations passed by, but he didn't move at all. Instead, he seemed to get much more confused and angry with each passing station. He was glaring at me a lot, switching to the windows each station, as if he was waiting to see which one I would get off on. Now he was giving me a real scary look. I tried to avoid his gaze as much as possible. At some point, he started to push his leg against mine. It's like when the train is riding fast, and because of its movements, you sometimes touch people near you and bump slightly into them when it's crowded. Him doing that was not natural though, because the train was almost empty. After some time, I was really getting awkward. Even when I changed position to be away from him, he would constantly rub his legs up against mine. It pissed me off. I looked straight at him, and then I knew immediately I was in danger. He was looking at me with this huge smile on his face. Since he'd noticed, I was now reacting. I was terrified. When the train stopped again at a station, I didn't really think. I jumped out of my seat and started to go out. He followed behind me. I was really scared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want him to follow me home because I lived in a really secluded place. If he were to follow me all the way, at some point he would be able to do anything to me. Near my own home, there would be no one around to hear or help me. I was trying to think fast when suddenly I got an idea. I stayed near the train before the door closed and walked near it like nothing happened. He was still following me and looking at me, but I tried to remain calm. When I heard the sound of the door about to close, I jumped back inside the train again. Right when the door was closing, he couldn't get in on time. I saw him looking at the closing doors in shock. He looked at me like he wanted to kill me. I went back to my seat and stared out the window looking at him to see what he would do. He was so furious. I was scared he was going to break the glass and jump right at my neck. The train finally started again. It was gradually pulling away from the platform. The man was staring at me, following me with his gaze the entire time. When the train finally passed that station, I started breathing normally again. After that, I stayed on a few stations and finally got off and changed sides to take a train in the direction of my home. I was looking behind me the whole time and ran home as fast as I could. It was only when I was in my room that I fully realized what had happened. That event was really a change for me. Before that, I was really carefree when I took the train or the subway, but from that time on, I started being a lot more cautious of my surroundings, especially when returning home at night. My mom's dog Punky was a very sweet, loving dog. She was an ESA dog, but trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I had never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she'd lived. Never growled, never nipped at anyone. She had no sense of smell, so she loved all animals and people. A real gentle giant among our little terriers at 60 pounds. What I'm getting at here is that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only ever saw it happen one time. I was 11 at the time this happened, and at home with my siblings who were 6 and 2 respectively. My then stepdad was at work. My mom had to go to the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. It was only a mile or 2 away, so it wouldn't take that long. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods on a dead-end road at the time. You had to really make an effort to get down there, find our house, navigate that rickety-ass driveway, and find our door. I was sitting there at the computer, having a grand old time watching some YouTube videos, when all of a sudden our dogs jumped up and started investigating down the hall. My siblings were both napping in the bedroom at the end of that hall at the time, so I figured they just stirred a bit and scared the dogs. Then though, Punky jolted upright, stood on the couch, and puffed her chest out. Her ears were perked up, fur standing on end, tail straight upright. She started to bark loudly. It boomed through the living room and echoed all around. All of a sudden, she jumped off the couch and went tearing down the hallway. I was already on edge because I'd never heard her bark before. I stood up and went to look down the hallway, ready to fight off what I was assuming was a shadow monster based on how the dogs were acting. But then, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. We didn't get visitors because of how weird our home was location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The only people who would ever show up were family, and they would never knock. I slowly walked toward the door. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky. I felt better with these 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were the size of a New York City sewer rat. I opened the door just a bit, only to see standing on our porch the sketchiest man I'd ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. Extremely thin, a taller man with dark hair and a sunken face, heavy bags under his eye, and half-managed hair, like he'd just given it a quick brush and figured that was good enough. Everything about him just seemed too thin, a little too shallow. His clothes were all off too. They were nice, but like fake nice, you know? Like a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and new jeans. Like one of those suits you'd buy from a factory or something. All his clothes were real dark too, despite the fact it was summer in Texas and it was definitely well into the hundreds that day. He had a plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like it had been covered up and taped over. I stared at the man in confusion. I definitely had never seen this guy before. I asked him what he wanted. He smiled in a way that was obviously fake and spoke in the same voice retail workers do. "Hey there, kiddo, I'm trying to sell this here carpet cleaner. You mind if I come in and show you how good it works?" Alarms were already going off in my head. This was just way too weird. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact he didn't even ask if my parents were home at all is unnerving. That meant he probably knew they weren't, and that was why he was there in the first place. I should have told him to get the fuck off our property, that I'd have to go talk to my mom. I didn't say that though. Instead, I shook my head and said, "We don't have a carpet." "Well now, hold on a minute. It works on other things too." He took a big step toward the door and shook the bottle at me. I started to freak out and was about to close the door. Thing is, our front door wouldn't even lock. It was broken and basically useless. I was sure something very bad was about to happen. I was terrified as I thought about what to do in the few seconds I thought I had before it did happen, when all of a sudden I heard it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared, snarling like she was feral. Slobber was flying from her mouth, her ears down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy heard it too. As I looked toward Punky, she tried to lunge past me. I just barely caught her as she tried her hardest to duck past me and attack this guy. The man freaked out and ran off the porch without saying another word, booking it down the driveway as I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs, and they started chasing him. Our small dogs chased him down the driveway and stopped about halfway, barking and jumping about. Punky stopped just on the porch though and watched him vigilantly, staring into the distance until he disappeared. As he ran down the road, I swear I saw someone join up with him when he got onto it. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. No barking or growling, just laying around, mouth and throat covered in slobber still. I realized my siblings were still in that room and ran to check on them. When I got to the bedroom, my siblings were sleeping soundly still, but the bedroom window was wide open, the curtains pushed all to one side, and items on the dresser in front of the window all shoved around. Someone had definitely been trying to climb through, no doubt in my mind. From what I can gather, the bedroom window was visible from the couch where Punky had been sleeping. I think someone was trying to climb through the window, Before Punky went after them and scared them off, the man at the door was obviously meant to distract me. They definitely hadn't expected Punky, because most of the time she was with my mom inside, while our small dogs were the ones the public saw more often. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house. On our way there, we saw the men walking up someone else's driveway. Men plural, because we watched a second one split off to wait by the road.